Hi everyone, my name is Nitya and I am from Team Belong. The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and a library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now on to today's session. This session is on political fiction, holding up a mirror in divisive times with Githa Hariharan and Meena Kandasamy. This session will be moderated by Resh Susan. Resh Susan is a freelance writer who writes primarily on books and culture. She runs the Book Satchel website and will be joining us from Kerala.
Our panelists, they need no introduction from me, really. Everyone knows them, but still we'll go with the norm of things. So Githa Hariharan. Githa Hariharan has been writing novels, non-fiction, children's books, and editing translations for nearly 3 decades. Her much acclaimed first novel, The Thousand Faces of Night, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book in 1993. She has been a cultural commentator through her essays, lectures, and activism. In 1995, Hariharan challenged the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act as discriminatory against women, leading to a landmark victory. Her most recent novel is I Have Become the Tide. Welcome, Githa.
Thank you.
Next, we have Meena Kandasamy. Kandasamy is a poet, fiction writer, translator, and activist who has combined her love for words with the struggle for social justice. Her second novel, When I Hit You, is a work of autofiction and was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018. Her most recent novel is Exquisite Cadavers. Welcome, Meena. All right. And good afternoon to a wonderful audience. I think East has already told how the session will be conducted. First, we'll have some questions. I'll pose some questions. Githa and Meena, you can answer in any order. Anyone can take a question. And the audience can send us their questions, which we will take in the last 30 minutes. Okay, you can send your questions whenever you want, but we'll answer them towards the end. Right. So this is really quite new and exciting, right? We are in this digital kind of literary fest in our own homes in different parts of the world. And right, so let's just begin, right? So Githa and Meena, to start with, I was hoping we could go with the emotion involved in writing. So where does political fiction, or in general, politics in writing fiction, where does it begin? Does it come from rage or anger or, yeah, over to you.
I'm not at all sure that it can be reduced to that kind of correspondence. I think rather than thinking in terms of a specific emotion, the most important thing you require to write, overtly political or otherwise political, unself-consciously political, is to ask a question. So it really is a state of confusion, it's a state of conflict, it's a state of doubt and questioning in your mind, which leads you, in fact, in real life, to be politicized, and which is exactly the starting point for a writer, as it is for an academic or an activist or a good student or a good reader. So I would not mystify this, or say that just because, in real life, something terrible could have happened to somebody, and the person could feel a great deal of rage. But that doesn't mean, sadly, that the person can put pen to paper and write something effectively.
Yes, that's true.
So we mustn't confuse real life experience, intention with the result.
And Meena?
This is very interesting. This question of, where does emotion come from? Where does the kind of the question to ask is, because when we write political fiction, the question is, where did this project come from? Or, because I really see it as something that, requires not just engagement with words, but, engagement with much more ideas. And I think for me, my first novel, which is possibly the most political book I've written, it's about a massacre of 44 Dalit men, women, and children. There are two reasons why I took this for writing. So there's many reasons, but I think one of the personal connection to this place, or what you would say the emotive connection, is that my father left this place, left Tanjore when he was in his 20s. He came from an analyst family. He grew up in an orphanage. His father abandoned the family. And for a lot of reasons, why did my father have to run away from Tanjore was a question I had to ask myself. Because, if you go to Tanjore, it's literally, I think, maybe after Kerala, the most beautiful place in this world. But then the inequality there is like, it's so extreme. And so for me, that was a personal question on, what does it mean to be on the margins in that kind of a place? With all these postcard green fields and, beautiful lakes and such clear blue skies. And on the other hand, the very political motivation of actually choosing Keelvanmani rather than any other Tanjore-based story was because in 2002, 2003, I was translating the essays of a Tamil Dalit leader, Tirumavalavan. And one of his essays is about, can you fence Venmani or kill Venmani? And the question that he asks is, Marxists lay claim to the struggle in kill Venmani, and everybody looks at it as a class struggle. And for him, the important question was, everybody who died was Dalits. So what about the fact that, they were also dying when they died for this, they were fighting for higher wages, but that's also involved a fight against caste supremacy. And why don't we forefront that? And for me, that's a question that even today, the left movement or the broader Marxist movement in India has to really, address, is the question of caste. But also when we talk about the history of any movement, we have to give the rightful place to Dalit people, not because, we have to be representational or denominational, but because they have been, at the forefront, at the vanguard, the pioneers of, the class struggle in India. So for me, it was to write about Keelvanmani was to not only write about feudal relationships and how, early communism challenged them, but also to talk about the central role of, Dalit people in challenging feudal patriarchy, Dalit people in becoming true communists and standing up for the red flag and not compromising at any point, even if it meant paying with their lives. And for me, just to forefront that struggle, to talk about, because when we think of communists, our idea is, somebody is so well versed in Marx and Lenin, and, we think of very theoretical aspect of communism, but to talk about, the real communist as a worker who believes in their right and fights against injustice and caste injustice, I think was so fundamental to it. So I think this was the urge to kind of, tell their story.
I think we wandered off a bit from the
a little bit
puzzled,
yes.
Because are we discussing the craft, the writerly aspect of it, which is quite different from explaining the ideological moorings of our work lives. So I think, if we end up having two sorts of discussions, it might be a little confusing.
So I'll just interrupt with a question. So Githa, you told about questioning. Everything comes through questioning, right? And Meena, you told about the communism, the Dalit struggle and all that. So which reminds me
No,
of
but I still believe I have to. I'm sorry to point this out, Githa. It is a question for me. It is a question of why does literature ignore Dalit struggle? Why does Marxism ignore Dalit contribution? So you think your books come from a question? My books come from a question as well. You don't have to put me down in a panel, Githa. You have to be respectful. You know, I choose how I answer my questions. You know, so you don't choose how I answer my questions. So if I talk about my ideological underpinnings, maybe it's because I have some ideological underpinnings here. No, you don't have to be dismissive right when I start answering a question. And everybody knows people wander off in panels. Thank you.
Meena
No, you must learn to
Githa.
listen. I'm sorry. No, it is an emotive aspect for me. The fact that Dalit struggle is not, placed at the center of communism is an emotive aspect for me. So I'm discussing my emotions here. Why do you disregard it?
No, I don't disregard it.
No, then why do you say, you should not wander away? I'm not wandering away. This is the center of my story.
I was confused. Please.
This is the center of my. This is the center of my exploration. So I'm answering my answer. You can't tell me how I should answer. I'm not wandering away anywhere. This is at the center of my writing. So when it is central to my writing practice, I have to talk about.
The next question.
Sorry,
Meena,
no. I feel offended, Resh. I have to talk about this.
Yes, I understand. Let's come to this in a little while. So we have this emotion of fear in our country. Fear is a very strong emotion right now because of the current political climate of the country. It's built on intimidation, silencing at a very personal level. We know what happened to Gauri Lankesh, silencing of minorities based on religion, based on sexual identity. There's a lot of intimidation. And we are even changing narratives and kind of changing the flavor of history. Right? Just twisting history to fit our own narratives. So in such a kind of environment, how does a new writer work their way through this atmosphere? Meena, I think
Meena, because
I'll ask you to answer
I'm the older one. So let's listen to Meena because I think she will have more interesting perspectives.
Yes. Meena, I'd love if you could answer this first.
No, the idea is, I think what is happening under the present political dispensation is obviously a kind of rewriting of history, but also I think a huge question of how does it concern the writer? If that's the question I'm trying to answer, how does history concern the writer, or how does political situations concern the writer?
I'm talking more about writers being silenced.
Yes.
Yeah.
So writers are silenced also because they decide to speak about certain things, and which kind of upsets people in power. And the reason that writers are actually having to speak about these things is also important because we live in a condition where a huge section of the media is again corporate owned. So the media doesn't become a free space. It doesn't become an independent space. So the kind of independent spaces for articulation has to come from writers. It has to come from social activists. It comes from a lot of places where we cannot completely outsource political questioning to the media. So I think, so therefore, I think, people like Gauri Lankesh, who ran her own paper, who was very, vocal in her beliefs, or the other rationalists who were killed, or anybody who is getting, like Rana Ayub is getting these death threats today for being a journalist and, expressing herself on Kashmir. And I think, the ones you are challenging what's a given narrative, you are, of course, threatened and silenced. And sometimes in the end, very unfortunate case of Gauri Lankesh, people, decide that it's far better to completely kill you than to let you to live. I still think that at the heart of it, we have to keep doing what work we are doing. And I also think that, it's something that we can come to later. It's in terms of writers like Anand Teltunde or Varavara Rao are in prison at 81 years of age. It really shows a lot about how writers are being treated.
Githa, based on your experience of writing for many years, how do you think a new writer can, traverse this kind of a political climate?
There's, of course, a long history of writers, of artists in general, but writers we are talking about in particular, writers being silenced by being made invisible by being rendered invisible. And I think this is what Meena was also implying in her first intervention. So we already know that there is this background. So let's not, though we are very happy to blame the right wing, and I would dearly love to do that for everything, but we have to remember there's already a long history of an imbalance of power in terms of who is center stage, whose voice is heard, who's rendered more invisible. So that is there in terms of gender, community, and of course caste, as we have already referred to it. So that is there. But in the last few years, there is absolutely no question that we have added to the old fault lines, to the horrors that we've had forever in India, the dividers of caste and the dividers of religion, and then of course Adivasi marginalization and so on. We've also had dissent, questioning in any form, also marked out for crushing. And of course for writers, the terror is, very, very practically speaking, that you don't even know what will be found quote unquote offensive. You know, so it's almost as if you have a group of people sitting there and saying, well, what shall we object to? So there is this new kind of crushing. And in fact, that is what I was trying to address in my novel, I Have Become the Tide, that you have old dividers like caste, not only persisting, but manifesting in new and horrible ways. And along with that, any kind of dissent, whether it is from caste movements, whether it is from individual writers, being crushed. And some of us, many of us, Meena included, are part of a thing called the Indian Writers Forum. And we hear from young people that there is a certain anxiety. And this is all the more so if you are, you know, already in that list of people to be invisibilized, you see? So you're not, people are not, you know, a lot of us live fairly cushioned lives, but there are going to be other people who are not going to get that immediate kind of support. And we have very long laundry lists we can, you know, come up with in recent times of writers who have been, even dead writers who've been posthumously censored, like the poet Pash.
Fai's poem is under scrutiny. So adding a little bit to that, so we see history and violence being repeating themselves, right? So Meena has written about the caste violence. Githa, you have written about violence in colleges, in workspaces. But even now we see there's no end. It's just going on repeating and repeating. Kashmir is an unresolved issue since the partition. There are still honor killings. Everything is politicized and communalized. Food and even the pandemic, everything. So in this kind of a climate, do you feel political fiction might seem futile? Or do you feel there's still hope for some change? It's a very big question.
May I say something here? Yes. You know, very early in your life, you discover that you have no real choice over the kind of voice you have, you know, whether it is as a writer or citizen, you know. And to me, increasingly, I'm beginning to feel that dissent, your active dissent, is in doing what you can well. If you're a teacher, you allow multiple points of view, you include, you don't exclude. Similarly with the writer, you ask as many questions as possible. You admit that you come with your own baggage of, you question your own ignorance and prejudice as much as you question the world's, you know. So it's not like a writer, more and more, the more you write, the more you learn how much you have to learn through the act of writing, through the act of listening, and through the act of reading other people. So, and I wouldn't say that political fiction, I'm a little hesitant about this phrase, because as I said in the beginning, some of our work is overtly political. Some of it, you know, I can't think of work which is not political. And that's a truism, that everything is, you know, all art is political and so on. But for those of us who are actually trying to make a political statement consciously, as Meena explained in the beginning, and I think this is a very important point that we need to discuss much more. What are the ways in which you are going to enter other worlds that you don't know or that you're not part of, which is inevitable for a writer? I think for me, both as writer and citizen, one idea that serves well is the idea of solidarity. So if you say, okay, when I wrote Fugitive Histories, it's not as if I've lived in Gujarat. It's not as if I'm Muslim. It's not as if I was there in 2002. But as I say throughout the novel, this is the act of writing. Other people's stories come and reside in your head and become yours. You will never experience it. You will never be the authority on it. But yes, it is your vocation and duty as citizen and writer to become part of it, not to lead it, not to speak for other people, but to become part of it.
I'll take the question to Meena. Meena?
Yes, I agree with Ma'am on, you know, a citizen and writer, but yeah, please continue with your question.
You've written, it's just a continuation of the same thing, the same question. Yeah. So you've written about caste violence in Gypsy Goddess, right? Mm-hmm. And this still keeps happening, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. At a very large level, police brutality, mm-hmm, everything, it just mm-hmm, keeps on happening. It's like there's no end. So mm-hmm, do you feel we'll have some change at some point? Or do you feel what you're doing is not what you're doing, the aim of political fiction? Do you feel it's becoming futile?
There's multiple aspects to this. One of the thing about you know, when you started this question was about caste atrocities do keep happening, and you know, police brutality repeats itself. So the story is endless in its many you know, repetitions. And this is where I think that for me, going back again to the choice of political fiction or the type of stories that I would like to say, choosing a story like When Money was very important, because it's not only political fiction, but it's also political fiction where the people win in the end, you know. Because after Kill When Money, I think the landscape changes, the consciousness of people changes. There's a certain militancy among Dalit people, but also a certain militancy in terms of becoming communist or having these ideas and fighting feudalism. So feudalism is never the same again. It also, so in that sense also, you talk about police brutality, so it's about exposing the state. So sometimes when you choose a story, you also want to choose an optimistic or a positive story to narrate, to mm-hmm, show that, you know, as much as everything is going against you, the state machinery is working against you, the feudal system is working against you, caste system is working against you, there's patriarchy that's working against you, all of these multiple things are still, you know, on the one hand, we can look at them as sites of oppression, but on the other hand, we can also look at them as sites of resistance. And I think for me to celebrate this resistance, whether it comes from, you know, instead of dismissing people as unlearned people or illiterate people, or just, you know, reducing them as women, to just look at how powerful they are, how powerful their militancy is in the individual. I think it's important to choose these kind of stories as well. So for me, it's a story of, you know, winning. And the other thing is also the question of, is political fiction futile, or what's political fiction trying to do? And here, I want to go to Ma'am's point about the writer as citizen and the writer as a writer. And here, as a citizen, or as, you know, as much as it's a very nuanced differentiation, for me, when I think of writing, I would think of it as making an intervention within literature and making an intervention in the public sphere. So mm-hmm, within literature, you don't see certain type of stories being told. The gaze is always, at least in my understanding, after the early novelists, like, you know, possibly Kamala Markandeya or, you know, Raja Rao, they used to, or even R.K. Narayan, there used to be, even if, you know, you can call it quote unquote a Brahmin gaze, it would still, you know, engage with India's villages. in some form or other. But I certainly think that over time it's become very urban centric literature, you know, like, or even Chetan Bhagat is still small town centric, but the village kind of begins to be either decentralized or disappear or push to the margin in terms of literary articulation, and to go back and to put these villages on the map, you know, instead of, you know, putting them as on the margins, to kind of centralize it. So Kilvenmani becomes the center of this universe in this book. So in that sense, it's and Dalit people, especially older Dalit women, become like central characters. So it's kind of, you know, trying to change how, you know, always in literature you have characters who are young, you know, or it's always about individual stories. So to say a collective story, so it's in one aspect it's an intervention. Political fiction is an intervention into literature. On the other aspect, this is also previously the question of, it's an intervention into the public sphere itself. So we have a public sphere in which, you know, and ma'am was talking about this question of recognition. So who gets recognized? On the one hand, it's about writers, but also a question of, in terms of struggle, who gets recognized? So who are the most prominent voices? Why do we only think of, you know, a very famous you know, possibly a Prakash Karat or a Brinda Karat might be our most known faces, of Sitaram Yechuri, our most known faces of communism. But what happens to the people who are actually working on the ground, people who sacrifice their lives? So in that sense, you know what I mean? Like for me, it's also to make an intervention in that sense, to say, Dalits have given up their lives for communism. You know, they also, why don't we put them in the center of our struggle? Why don't we learn to respect and to learn from that? So it's also about reclaiming within politics that space for, you know, people who have been oppressed, who have been marginalized, or largely invisibilized as well. And I think, for instance, yeah, where's women's contribution? So it's all of these questions.
Yes.
So let me add a couple of lines to that.
Yes,
One is, as I think this bears repetition, what Meena said about, I think as a writer, you know, there's so much that you can do which is bleak and filled with despair. Whether it's outright violence, or I must point out, it's not just the obvious the writer is interested in, but, you know, the mental violence, what people, the fears people have, the thwarted dreams and so on. Anyway, but while there is a temptation to just do that, but I think a writer, at least the kind of writer I am, and I suspect the kind of writer Meena is, you also want the narrative of resistance always to balance, because as you say, otherwise it's futile. In fact, it's futile to live unless you have some hope, right? So, so that is one thing. My own personal take has been, as a writer, and I'm saying this in retrospect, it's not that I planned it, but I find in my books that one way in which I do this is that I have multiple voices, but I always have some young people. So whether it is a young, a girl in whose brother goes missing in 2002 in Gujarat in Fugitive Histories, or in I Have Become the Tide, it's all very well to go 900 years back and talk about failed action, which are important because that's part of history. But to talk about what happens, what are the opportunities for young people in terms of choices? What stage are we at in redeeming those promises made by the Constitution to young people, to include more young people? So my personal choice as a writer has been to always include the stories. And when I say stories, I really mean the private. That's what the writer is there for. We're not reporters. We might report certain things. We might hook our narratives onto real life events. But really our value, I think, is to go backstage and say, what did she feel like when she was being hit? What did he dream about, you know, and so on.
Yes, so I'd like to take a question from there. Both of you, you've written in different genres, poetry, nonfiction, essays, fiction, children's fiction. So personally, do you think you have a preference in making your political voice heard? Do you feel that you're most comfortable in one genre? Or do you have a favorite, you know, to put out what you would like to say?
It's more as if the genre has a favorite in you.
Okay.
I don't think other writers might be lucky, but I don't see myself sort of, sort of saying, okay, I'm going to write a short story and it comes to me. It just...
What about you, Meena? You've written poems as well
yes,
as fiction.
Yes, it's quite interesting, but it's also very personal for me because I find poetry very effective at communicating, politics, but also intimacies. At the same time, I think my poetry kind of completely disappeared after a particular relationship in my life disappeared. So yeah, it's a very fickle friend in that sense. But yeah, coming back to the question of I love to read short stories, but I can't write them for the life of me, because I really think that once a story grips me, I start living with it. I really need the room of a novel. I need that space to go into it. I think it's because I see it as a personal thing. I think it's because I'm really intense and I want to ask too many questions and, like go really, really deep into understanding. So I'm not bothered about many things. So the few things that bother me, I think I really get too deeply involved. So yeah, for me, I think I will always be writing what I call novels. So, just because there's so much
I have a
room.
theory. I think all of us have been, this is such an echo of what my own experience was. Not that I ever wrote serious poetry like Meena did, but I think the novel sort of spoils you. It is such a spacious and complex thing, and we're lucky to live in times where we can make pretty much what we like of the novel.
So you get addicted to novel writing.
No, you can experiment, which is very important for many of us.
Yeah, and and I think there's a space to explore, space to change points of view. There's also space to bring nuance, because one of the big problems is, again, we need a lot of nuance right now. You just can't say one thing, and then you also have to like immediately give rejoinders and clarifications. So like when talk becomes so hugely contested, and everything can be taken out of and into context, and things like that. I think a novel comes completely solid in that sense. Like it already anticipates the questions that will come our way, the criticisms that will come our way. So I think it's kind of like a very
I think for an Indian, a novel is great because it's multiple. It's like living in a crowd. There are multiple voices, multiple narratives.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Githa, you mentioned that all books are political in some form. So you might say writing is a political act, and even reading is a political act. And both these activities, they include a lot of thinking, solitude, agreeing, disagreeing, all that. But every person, be it a writer or a reader, they have some walls around them, right? Based on their upbringing, their religion, their friends, where they stay, so many factors. So when a reader is reading a book, how do they, get past these prejudices and read a book in a non-biased manner? And I'd like to extend it to the writer also. Every writer will also have prejudices. So how do you get past these walls and produce a wholesome piece of work?
Knowledge, whether it is by actually meeting people in the flesh or the replacement, which is reading, is one way to break down your prejudices, because ignorance is, you could grow up being told that, I don't know, some detail, the stuff of which prejudice is made, Muslim kitchens are dirty. Now, obviously, you need to go and see one. You need to live a life where it is inclusive, but you can't live every life. You can't see everything. So in a way, reading and writing are activities, and that's why, or in the university, that's why it's called an education, because you're widening yourself mentally. That doesn't mean that once you have learned that, once you have said, this is my conviction, that you've really learned it. It's very much like feminism. you come to it. You suspect, all of us women, at some point in our early lives, we said, you know, why are we being treated differently? It could be something really small and petty, but you begin to notice difference, which is a very important thing to notice, you know. And then you ask the question, then you find out how much can you push. You know, is something going to happen to you? You know, you might have a kind of a weird thing that if you have your periods, you have to sit separately and, you know, lightning will strike you if you go to the temple or something. Then you experiment. What is rational? What is man-made? You know, and then but it's something in your life that you have to renew every single day. I think most women will admit that you have to, you can't simply sit there and say, you've learned all about equality. You have to learn to live it. And I think with caste, the same thing happens. With community, the same thing happens, because there are some of those, you know, what was conditioned into you that you have to be very conscious of and say, oh, the alarm just went off. You know, because some of it is not, some of those prejudices you have been able to identify, and reason and experience have taught you that you should push it out. But the residue is always there, and it's an ongoing exercise. And I really just want to add one point there. You know, when I was reading from I've Become the Tide in one of the cities, a lot of people in the audience, very nice people, I'm sure, middle-class people, said, about 3 or 4 from that audience said, I'm so lucky I grew up in a household where we really didn't think about caste. So, I mean, of course, I didn't know them from Adam. Maybe they had wonderful families. So I said, look, I am only going to say what my wonderful friend Bezwada Wilson said to me once, which is, all we want is to also reach the stage where we needn't think about caste. And I think that is something terribly important for those of us who are born into, you know, into upper castes, that we should remember all the time.
That's a very good point. Meena?
Yes, thanks for this question, Resh. So there's 2 aspects of it, like in terms of a reader, how do you get past these walls? Walls of prejudice, I'm sure there's you know, that's something, but also I think some of these walls, and I have to really admit that you really just don't end up getting past. For instance, I'm not sure I engage with a lot of science fiction, or, you know, if I have to read about gadgets and space and theory, I would have a mental block about that kind of thing, because I would just be intimidated, you know, by, you know, by the mention of, let's say, you know, complex science, or, you know, things like that. So, which means that you do deprive yourself of another type of reading experience. So, so on the one hand, yeah, it can be prejudice about a certain type of book, a certain type of writing, which you think is not for you. So I think that, yes, everybody can't be, the thing is, as much as writing is great, everybody can't be forced to read everything. People are still going to read what they like to read.
Right.
And the, yeah, and the other thing is, in terms of a writer and how do you, I don't know what the question is about, breaking down walls, or, you know, overcoming your own prejudices.
So do you feel like the writer has to, you know, stand in a middle ground and then see all sides and then write something?
For me, the middle ground doesn't exist, because the middle ground is another place of you know, where you when you say you're neutral, you're also oppressing a lot of people with the neutrality, because I don't think either the way I've been politicized or the way I have experienced things, I don't think you cannot take a side. You have to really, really take a side. At the same time, the entire this process of fiction is that you have to be subtle, like, you know, you just can't, you can, you know, even poetry, I think, allows you the space to scream. It allows you to be vocal. And I think on Twitter, you can, you know, like, this is the side I take. In fiction, you really can't be hoarse, I think, in the, you know, you certainly, because people would be like, this is someone shouting. So I think you really have to inhabit other people. And for me, in all the 3 of my works, inhabiting other people, especially like writing, let's say, from the point of view of the landlords, and
Okay.
show how naturally entitlement came to them, how they felt that other people asking for their rights was basically the other people taking away their rights, So to kind of enter into their, it can be a poisonous place to enter, but I think the fact that you're a writer means that you learn to encounter, look into the beast, the thing that I think it's very important to know the nature of the thing you're fighting. So
Right.
yeah.
So how do you balance this?
May I just add a couple of things?
Yes,
It's always
Githa,
interesting as we are listening, you want to underline certain things or agree or add a nuance. I think there's no such thing as objectivity. And so this middle ground is all nonsense. But what is interesting, though, is to both in real life, when we are thinking of a what shall I say, an opposition, a resistance which has multiple voices, then you think in terms of common ground. And again, I come back to that idea of solidarity. Yes, of course, there must be different movements, but in real life, as well as of course, you're not writing propaganda, but, you have to put it into an artistic form. But you are looking for alliances, you are looking for common ground, whether it's women's movements or caste movements or class movements, etc. Now, that is the ongoing struggle to how to find that common ground. So I think, that is I just wanted to add a rather lovely story here. So it's good to learn from our grandmothers, the global grandmothers. Fatima Mernissi, the wonderful Moroccan sociologist, her grandmother never left the Haram. So she lived within those walls, okay? Now, the point is, and when I was writing When Dreams Travel, I was looking at this with great interest. But she apparently said to Fatima, what I think is like a writer's primer, she said, it is your duty to go out and explore Allah's beautiful planet, because it's only by trying to understand others, people as well as places, that you will understand yourself. And that's what beauty is. And I think actually that sums up what the writer has to do, because as Meena says, if you have to inhabit, I have become the tide when I had to inhabit a right-wing assassin. A part of you sort of is revulsed, because you cannot, neither Meena nor I would
bring yourself to
even imagine ourselves, killing somebody. So I think that leap of the imagination is what the writer does on the basis of this sound inquiry and exploration of the real world.
So Meena, you talked about we have to be subtle while writing fiction. So how does this balance come, this balance between your artistic need and your political voice? How does the novel become essentially human?
I think the idea of so I think the best propaganda is propaganda that's also insidious. That's not, as much as I'm very much a fan of sloganeering and being part of political movements, and I identify myself as a Marxist, I identify myself with a lot of Dalit movements. But I think for me, the idea is also within fiction, you have to still, people, you should, as a writer, you shouldn't be dismissed as, writing only propaganda. But the other point of question is also, I have this quote from Toni Kate Bambara that's written, she's a Latin American writer, and she says, the duty of the radical artist is to make the revolution irresistible.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think in that sense, and I read this word irresistible from a very intimate, almost sexualized meaning, in the sense is that your writing has to, as an artist, but in the sense as a radical writer, your writing has to seduce a reader into believing in your politics. And I think seduction is not something that you go and you just don't grab the person you like, you really have to be so coy about it, so seductive about it, but also so just beautiful about it. And I think in that sense, the coming together of beauty and justice, and the fact that, there is something very righteous about, this kind of struggle. It just has to, you kind of have to, in a sense, bleed on the page, but also let the reader understand where all of this comes from, and, speak to them from a very emotive, intellectual, but also a very intimate place. So I think this is where my writing comes from, to take the reader almost like you would take a lover. So, and it's not easy. So, it takes years maybe to get someone to love you. And I think to get someone to love what you're trying to say is not easy. You really have to, possibly that's why I think I need the space of a novel, but I do approach political fiction the way I would approach a lover. So for me, I think that's kind of where I come from. So as a writing process or whatever, yeah.
Githa, would you like to answer this?
This characters having a life of their own and so forth is I think of a lot of what we say about the writing later as valid, but they're all well-constructed lies, but the well-constructed part is very important, because over the years, I'm a little wary of discussing this too much. I think that I do not think of a message. Very often I'll get an email saying, ma'am, what is the message of this novel? And I sort of cringe because I hope that's not what I'm doing. I hope I'm doing something more complex. So it's not that I know the answer. I think a generous dose of humility is a good thing in a writer. And that's one of my few virtues, I suspect. But I don't know the answer. But the artistic part is situating certain questions in the right human settings, within human beings who are of interest to you, either because you are afraid of them, or you identify with them, or you love them, or you're curious about them. So to me, my convictions, whether it's feminism or Marxism or whatever, will leak into my work, as will my initial bringing up. There's no denying all that. All that will leak into it. But the entire project for me is an artistic one. Mm-hmm. So you can have the most powerful story in the world. You can have the most powerful convictions politically. You can be the goodest citizen in the world. But if your artistic endeavor doesn't work, the novel will not work.
So just diverting a bit into how we consume information in the world. So right now, it's everything is through social media. There's a lot of trolls, misinformation, changing history, all that happening. But at the same time, both of you try to get your voice heard through your own platforms, through forums, through your writing, etc. So in the middle of so much noise, how can you be heard? How can a writer be heard through all the noise? And do you feel like, we are in these echo chambers and we are shouting to like-minded people, but so how do we get the point across from one to another?
One-line answer. I have no idea whether I'm heard, but I'm damned if I'm going to shut up because of that.
Okay. Meena, would you like to add something?
I think especially being on social media, or where like Twitter, where I'm very, very active, I think there's a certain, I think it's very important because unlike regular media, social media is not completely under, in the sense, your content is still your content. You are able to express your frustrations, and you're able to do it immediately. You're able to do hashtag, you're able to do campaigns and activism. So I wouldn't dismiss it just because it doesn't necessarily have the rigors of a novel that you spend 7 years working or 8 years working. it doesn't mean that what you write there is any less legitimate or comes from a place of lesser outrage. I wouldn't go so far as to call it art. It's not. But it's very important to engage and to also have this kind of place of articulation, because otherwise it's the idea that you're screaming into the void. And sometimes you do see that I at least have seen that, campaigns have some effect. For instance, I can just give an example, is when there's a BJP union minister who tweeted his salutations to Brahmeshwar Mukhia, who was the man who was running this feudal militia called the Ranveer Sena. So the Ranveer Sena alone was responsible for massacres of Dalits in Gujarat, in Bihar, in the 90s and early 2000s. So basically entire villages of Dalits like Batani Tola, Lakshmanpur Bate, 56 Dalits, 61 Dalits, completely massacred by this Ranveer Sena. And here was a sitting BJP minister who is, quoting and, saluting him on his death anniversary. And the fact that, we started this hashtag campaign asking BJP to either remove this guy or asking him to, apologize for this, saying that, is this what Dalit lives don't matter to you, means that he had to at least delete his tweet, and that kind of thing is that, on the one hand, he wants to signal to his followers that, I'm still part of this Bhumihar elite, and just we can go around killing people. But on the other hand, the fact that you are able to police somebody who has this kind of, killing rage, who wants to celebrate the deaths of, clusters of Dalit people, if you're still able to make that kind of, intervention, I still think it's powerful. So it's not an echo chamber, because as much as our echo chamber is an echo chamber, we still have an effect, and we are being watched and we are being monitored, I think, really microscopically. But sometimes you can use their obsession with you in order to, at least, get a point across.
So I think we are running out of time. We could have gone on a really, really long discussion. So we'll just move on to the audience questions, right? So Mukherjee has asked, how does a writer working on political fiction prevent themselves from appropriating the stories of people who are marginalized as a pure crafting exercise? Meena, would you like to go first?
Again, the question is, what is appropriation? Because I think it's a question I really think a lot about. On the one hand, there is imperialist gaze, there's white gaze, and all of, actually appropriating a story in order to make money out of it, or in order to gain yourself visibility and all of the other things. On the other hand, I also think that, especially for writers of color, somebody who lives in the UK now, the question of appropriation can sometimes backfire, because what happens is that you also start getting painted into your own little box. So if I'm a South Asian immigrant, then I only write about brown women, like to write even about, let's say, an Iranian or a Tunisian becomes taking somebody's life. And I think as a writer, as a fiction writer, I want to be really careful about this. But and also the other fact is, we speak about appropriation, at least I haven't accused anyone of appropriating, but I think that if there is a choice between a story never being told and somebody telling a story, I would always want somebody to tell the story. And the fact is, we can always go ahead and then correct the narrative, correct versions of it, challenge these versions of it, do whatever we want. But I think silence is so much more disturbing than the fact that, the wrong person is saying the right story. So and a part of my approach for this also comes from the fact that my partner, for instance, is an activist, and I've been with a lot of people who are politically active, both men and women, and all of them, unlike writers, people who don't, they're not writers in any sense. They always want more people to be involved. They want more people on the streets. They want more people holding banners. They want more people at their protests. They want more people rallying. And I really think that that inclusivity that you find in resistance, that inclusivity that you find in protest, I think we have to become much more inclusive, that let everyone come, let everyone say, let everyone take part, because what we want is that taking part. Unfortunately, because we work in a hierarchical industry, and industry which, is run in sometimes of who you know or who you are, it so happens that it's not only mere participation. It just becomes that somebody from the right background becomes catapulted into fame, whereas other voices are silenced. And I think that's where the problematic aspect comes. Everybody taking part in struggle, everybody saying similar stories of oppression is not the problem. I think a lot of it depends on
Githa?
the way the industry perception matters.
Right, I'll just move on to Githa.
Quickly, let me just add to what Meena said rather than repeat what she has said. I think this is a question that you also have as academic researchers. Is this sort of, does it reek of a kind of ethnographic exercise, however virtuous you may be? Now, sometimes you can, within the craft, find ways of addressing that. So again, in my novel Fugitive Histories, I actually, rather than being the omniscient narrator who knows exactly what's going on in people's heads, I had a young woman from Bombay who's actually an intern with a filmmaker and is trying to learn filmmaking. And she goes to Ahmedabad, and you see some of the survivors, victims, what is usually called victims, but we now like to call survivors, through her eyes. So this is a kind of course, you can't do this each time, but I'm saying in this specific novel, that helped to allow the writer to admit implicitly that, look, I don't know everything about everything here, but let's find out along with this woman who's also gone there and doesn't know. So, you can use certain narrative strategies to do that. For those of us who like to have multiple voices and narratives in the space of the novel, this becomes convenient because you can have somebody as a bridge. This is what I had in I Have Become the Tide. So I have, what we would call a Dalit poet, a cattle skinner poet from 900 years back. And then I have 3 Dalit students trying to get into medicine. But in between, I have a kind of a bridge character who teaches. And because he's done research on one of the poets, he's assassinated. So he is the bridge. So you have to find yourself a kind of vantage point from which you're not shirking your duty of looking at these other worlds and other lives, but you're not pretending you're an expert. Writers do not have to be experts. So as long as you're admitting, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, that you have vast areas of ignorance, but you also have these very important questions, and you are going to talk and you are going to analyze and you're going to be ruthless in the process, I think that's good enough.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question. I think we'll, shorten the answers a bit because there are a lot of questions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So next is from Ruchi. Can you please comment on the political fiction published in India for young adults? What do you think about the current situation in the genre?
I will pass. I don't know anything about fiction for young adults.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to pass as well.
All right. So it's something to think about. All the audience and us, it's something to think about.
Yeah.
Right. So Tista has asked, if sides of prejudice can be viewed as sides of resistance, what role do writers play in reshaping and reimagining this narrative?
Yes, yeah, that's possibly a quote that I just said, and I think the writer's role is to amplify, is to kind of tell the stories of the resistance, I think, and just be honest about, for instance, as I said earlier, you could, my third novel, for instance, deals with the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And, it's one of the most successful political things there. So how do you celebrate resistance there? So, how do you centralize the role of, young people and what they were doing on the streets and what was their concerns and how did they have to overthrow a dictatorship. So I think in a lot of it is just give voice to, you know, the people who are making it happen, or, you know, let them inhabit your pages, and then I think they will speak for themselves once they're on a page. So about, you know, choosing those kind of characters who are vehicles of history and, yeah, letting them be their own people.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question then.
Okay.
Right. So Preeti has asked, do you think the way language is being manipulated by political parties and media in particular compels a writer to be politically correct and not be radical?
You know, in India, we can't talk of language in such a simple way because we have to take into account what's happening in all the different languages, and we mustn't sort of talk about English as if it represents everything. But I think definitely the writer is taking into account the violence, not just actual real life violence, but the kind of violent discourse that is all around us. I think that is how do you reflect that language without, you know, so it's a kind of a terrible vicious cycle, because you have that kind of violent discourse language-wise. You might put that in your novel to show what's going on, and that will actually offend people, and people will say, you know, so some of the things, comments you see, for example, on social media by the trolls, if you put that in a novel, a lot of people are going to be offended. So that is there. Now, politically correct, you know, finally, a good piece of writing, as a good piece of music or film, is what kind of risks are you willing to take? Mm-hmm. You know, and are you going to be afraid of people telling you that, you know, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't imagine you're a writer? Are you going to be afraid of people saying you've appropriated somebody else's voice? Are you going to be able, you know, you can, if you live in a state of fear, you will never write anything. There's no guarantee.
Meena?
I'm now writing a young woman who's always saying the most politically incorrect stuff. And I think that I personally don't like a lot of liberal speak, you know, so, you know, because I think there's a certain rank hypocrisy in liberal speak that kind of hides and I would rather have somebody exactly tell me what they think than, you know, couch the language in something that's much more, you know, manipulative, or in which somebody is like, you know, so for instance, a lot of privilege theory, or the fact is, oh, I understand my privilege. Just somebody acknowledging that they understand their privilege doesn't change anything or dismantle systems. So in that sense, yeah, for me, political correctness is not as important as being, you know, as being genuinely committed. And I think these are different things. So political correctness is just a veneer for me. So.
And, you know, I must add that play is also very important as craft in the book. So irony and a little play, mm-hmm. you know, is very much part of the art. So if that kind of political correctness, that becomes another form of people telling you how to write, which of course
even
is
satire is very popular to make a statement.
Mm-hmm.
So Meena, there's a question directed to you mm-hmm. from Anushri. I have read The Gypsy Goddess and it changed a lot inside me. It must have taken a lot out of you to write the book. In such a situation, how does a writer deal with their personal triggers to ensure the story completes?
This is an interesting question, because a lot of people actually ask me this question about personal trigger, because I wrote a novel that is partly based on my own marriage, and they're like, how could you write? Because it's triggering. And I think this question of trigger is, you know, very valid in therapy and stuff like that. But in terms of actual right, and I always try to answer or deflect the question about personal trauma by saying that, you know, I wrote about a village of 44 people being burnt to death. And I don't think that any day in any form of place, I would think my trauma was greater than that. So, you know, I've written trauma of much larger scale, which has affected me much more. And I think that when I come to the page, I can't speak for anyone else but me. And also as somebody writing in a second language, just trying to get the words right. And also as a very slow writer, because I write the way I write fiction, also the way I write my poetry. So every word I really choose and put them there, almost as if I would in a poem, you know. So I don't write anything superfluous. So when you start paying that kind of enormous, excruciating attention to constructing even a sentence, I think the fact of the trauma for you then becomes not, you don't engage, or as much as it's depressing and sad and makes you break down, I don't think you engage. Your commitment to getting the sentence right possibly outweighs how depressed and sad and outraged you feel about it. And because when a person reads you, they're not going to understand that Meena was heartbroken about this, she was depressed about this, she would have literally killed every landlord in Venmani. Nobody's going to, this is not things for which you are going to get any brownie points. Mm-hmm. That doesn't matter. What would matter to the reader is how much you convey this outrage, how much you make them feel the atrocity, how much you make them angry. And I think that is, again, the question of craft. It's the question of, so you really have to use all your emotions, but at the same time, make sure that it has an effect. And part of it is also coming from a poet's background. When you're a poet, you get instant feedback, this works, this doesn't work, this line will work. So I think there's some of that as well, even at the time of writing, if it will go down well or not go down well. So yeah, there is trauma, but there is also the just the process and the meticulousness of craft that kind of helps you or anesthetize not your feelings, but at least the creation of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Meena. We have another question from Anam. Would you suggest that literary theory turns political fiction into a very elitist genre and takes away the revolutionary potential? There's one more. What kind of theories do you think we need in our times to truly cull out the political advantages of fiction?
I'm just going to say that I'm no academic. I'm not anti-theory, but it has its place. I don't write to fit into theory. I'm sure there are others who will do that anyway. So we write for entirely different reasons. And though we don't, I think it would be foolish to think that your novels will change the world and will change things on the street. But what you are trying to do really simply, forget theory, practice. What you're trying to do is give people a fresh handle, an alternative handle to view the world around them, to view people around them, to view imbalance of power around them. That's really what political fiction is. We should have probably started with talking about what political means to each of us. Unfortunately, people, when they keep saying, don't politicize this, don't politicize that, they mean something else altogether. I think all three of us are agreed that political is a good word. It just means how you view the power structures in the world, because they're always uneven.
No, I actually had a question related to that. Let Meena finish answering this. I think I'll ask that. Meena?
The thing is, see, theory is not in itself a bad thing, because theory comes out of praxis. It comes out of, things that are on the ground, and just helps us all understand, So, so there's, Marxist theory or feminist theory. Theory is basically about shining a light and letting people understand these things. But unfortunately, a lot of theory has become, for the lack of a better word, it's become very Brahmanical, in the sense that it's become like the Vedas. Not everybody can access it. So only the people who access it can speak the same jargon. And sometimes this jargon reduces, and it's not only the literary theory that does this. For instance, I find a lot of NGO reports, when they write about people's life, they completely anesthetize it, they neutralize it. There's no feeling there, And I think the same thing happens to literary theory. I actually have a poem called Once My Silence Held You Spellbound, which is about how when people are theorizing your life, you just don't feel that you are represented there, whether you're a traumatized woman or you're a marginalized caste, whatever it is. And I think that sometimes So we have to make our own theory, you know, like we have to be the ones at the same time, not only doing our writing, but also doing our theorization. We have to do the fiction and the metafiction at once, which is possibly, yeah, why I find my books are, you know, marrying the two all the time, because I'm not only telling you a story, but I'm also telling you why I am telling it and how I'm telling it. And I think it's an unfair burden, but I also think part of the unfair burden is because I want to do, I want to carry my theory as well, you know, so I think that's some of it. So I want to hear your question, Resh. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a very basic question, but I think we should have discussed that. What is the fiction, or why do you write political fiction? Is it about hope, or giving a voice to the unheard, or, you know, something altogether different?
I think it's a lot of it because of who I am, I think. So yeah, I think politics has always been my concern. I think all of us are political animals, you know, whether we are either political publicly or we are political in our denial, and which denial also is, you know, a form of politics. And one of those things is also, sometimes you think there's no politics somewhere. Like, for instance, I always used to think about people writing about marriages, and believe me, I was just this really young, you know, teenager or early 20 something, and I'm like, oh, that's such a dreary domestic thing. But then, you know, life teaches you that even that domestic place is a place very vitiated by, you know, all kinds of politics there. And, you know, men oppressing women is inherently political in itself. So yeah, what we tend to even dismiss as non-political or domestic in itself can be very, very, very political. So yeah, for me, political in that sense encompasses our lives. Our lives are political.
Githa?
Well, you know, it's very closely tied to the question of why does one write? You don't know, because you were given this voice. I write because you know, my singing might not be as good as my writing or my acting or, you know, whatever. I'm not being facetious here, but in terms of what you write, that is the person you are with your multiple identities. In my own case, I think it is the way I came to certain questions of inequality, starting with women, and then realizing in India you can't only be talking about women, it has to be multiple axes of inequality. In other words, you're coming to your book, to your writing, not just as a writer, but as a citizen. I would say in my case, even as a mother, because this is my investment in my views, you know, for young people, for my children, and for my friends. So the passion is to have a certain, to argue what is a possible way to live that will mean better lives, more choices for more people. You know, so that sounds boring, but the important thing to do it as a writer is to do it with humor, with imagination, with poetry, and with passion.
So as a woman writer, writing political fiction, did you ever feel that you were expected to say only one kind of stories, or did you feel any restrictions at any point, or that you have to be louder to be heard?
Well, you know, you have to be quite cussed to be a writer. So people will say all kinds of things. And, you know, you're not being paid a salary or something to take it from anybody. So you just ignore it and go on. You don't need anyone's permission to write. I remember my first novel happened to be about 3 generations of Indian women. And there was a kind of slightly patronizing, yes, she seems to know about it, you know, as if to say, because you're a woman, you're an expert on women's lives. When the second novel was about something else altogether, there was a general, you know, a little bit of a rap on the knuckle to say that, why are you getting beyond yourself? Just stay in your little ghetto, which is why you feel a bit, you're in a dilemma about whether you want to be called a woman writer or not. You know, it's hard enough being a writer. forget what people call you, but every day to tell yourself you're a writer and do the work is pretty hard, you know. And of course, it's obvious that you're a woman. I mean, it's how stupid. But you can have women who are, you know, anti-women, and you can have men who are struggling to be feminists. So let's not romanticize any of these bonds, I think.
We'll take another audience question. Meena, this is for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think we don't have more Marxist fiction? There are some widely read books with Marxist threads. Example, Normal People by Sally Rooney, but not too many. And have you considered writing such fiction? And what might be the elements of good Marxist fiction?
Well, I think both my I think all three of my novels are very Marxist in that sense, because the first is about a class struggle. The second is about, somebody being married to a Maoist. So there's a lot of Marxist theory in When I Hit You as well. Not just a strand, but actually how a kind of, brochurist, how people can even use Marxist theories to basically put women in their place and, deny them feminist articulations. So engaging with Marxism also means, shining the light on when Marxism gets misused, And so, I do think that for me, it comes very naturally to me, because I don't see Marxism as something alien or outside of myself. I just live in it or live with it. So I do hope people also write about it. I think people do write about it without being aware of being Marxist, because I think, like if you write a sentence where somebody's meeting in a coffee day and, having a cool, chill, whatever, it still is a statement on class, so it might not be in that quote unquote sense Marxist fiction, but there's class everywhere. You just have
a
to
lot
look
of
for
things
it.
are subtle. Is that what you're
they're just subtle and it's just there.
We have another question. Is it possible to move to another dimension or type of writing or framework where it's no longer binary, where there's no longer just a choice between fiction and non-fiction? It's quite a philosophical question.
That's a good question. Ma'am, do you want to take that? Because I have something to say on that.
Sure. Well, I wrote a book called Almost Home, which is actually a book of essays. But I always describe it as the sort of essays that a fiction writer might write, which is that, for us, I think, or at least for me, it's impossible, say, to write about Algeria and to write about Fanon without wondering, what was he like? When he was thinking, when he was planning some of those, what was he doing? So actually seeing it like a film in your head, which is of course how writers work. And similarly, you have the other side. So say a Frenchman like de Tocqueville, who writes about democracy in America and has certain ideas about freedom, but he doesn't see for a minute that it applies to Algerians. So then you actually use, I had portraits, vignettes, which are fiction. But what is this man like that he can dehumanize one part of the world and humanize one part of the world? Now, the question there is completely, if you like, something to be addressed by nonfiction, which is how does a colonizer have ideas about democracy and freedom, but it doesn't apply to the subjects? The answer might be, the simple answer might be that you dehumanize, but how does it happen in human beings? So I think for me, that was the closest I came to combining little bits, nuggets of fiction within, so actually constructing for myself, Washington speaking, Washington and Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence. Remember, it's 4th of July today. He was writing the Declaration of Independence and his slave Richard was standing behind with a cup of tea. So you take that and write a little fictional vignette. At least that's how I saw it.
All right. So I think, we've exceeded our time actually a little bit.
Yeah.
So would you like to say something, both of you, just a line?
Thanks for this panel. Actually, there was an earlier question about women writer, and I'm actually really happy for, you know, both Resh and for Githa ma'am being here. But for me, the idea is that to put two women writers and call it a political fiction panel, I think that's really radical, because it doesn't happen before. I think the writing that I do is really, really political, but I think because people always, like, even the most political books, people are like treating it as domestic fiction or, you know, just reading the story of, you know, husband and wife or a marriage, instead of reading it as, you know, much more larger political commentary. And I think in that sense, women always, irrespective of what you write, somebody always catches on some personal, trivial, intimate aspect of it and makes it all about that. So just to give us this platform to speak as political fiction writers, at least for me, it's a very new experience. So I'm very thankful for that, and thankful for this moderation and for Githa ma'am's answers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Meena.
Well,
Githa?
I hope in this time of lockdown that our friends who are watching us, who sadly we can't see, will use the reading act and the writing act to understand why existing differences have become even sharper and more murderous in these times of COVID. Thank you.
So I guess we come to an end here. Thank you so much, Meena, and thank you so much, Githa, for joining and for your
Thank you.